Remember those clever kitchen tricks your grandma knew, but never shared? Those simple hacks stretched meals and saved money when times were tough. Ever wonder why she kept them to herself? Stretching mashed potatoes with canned milk was one of those quiet little miracles your grandma probably pulled off without saying a word. Back in the day, real cream was expensive and hard to come by, but families still expected those mashed potatoes to be smooth and rich like they came from a fancy restaurant. Enter the humble can of evaporated milk. It sat on pantry shelves for emergencies, but your grandma knew it was more than a backup. It was her secret to making mashed potatoes go further and taste better without draining the budget. The trick was simple. Swap cream for canned milk, whip it in, and suddenly those mashed potatoes turned creamy, fluffy, and satisfying. You would never guess there was no cream in sight. Grandmas never made a big deal out of it. They just got it done, quietly stretching meals in ways that saved money but kept everyone at the table smiling. You probably ate those potatoes growing up and never knew the clever shortcut hiding in plain sight. Keeping pie crust flaky with vinegar is one of those strange little tricks your grandma knew, but probably never explained. It sounds odd at first. Vinegar in dessert? But for anyone who has ever bitten into a pie with that perfect, tender, flaky crust, there is a good chance vinegar played a quiet role. See, vinegar messes with the gluten just enough to keep the dough soft, stopping it from turning tough or chewy when baked. It was never about making the crust taste vinegary. You would never even notice the flavor once it hit the oven. It was all about texture. Grandmas learned early on that if you wanted those delicate, bakery-style pie crusts without wasting expensive butter or shortening, a sneaky splash of vinegar in the dough did the trick. They might not have mentioned it out loud, some secret stayed in the kitchen, but that pie crust spoke for itself. It flaked apart just right, every time, without anyone ever knowing how clever that recipe really was. Turning bacon grease into a flavor booster was one of those sneaky habits grandmas had down to a science. You would never catch them wasting a single drop of bacon fat. After breakfast, they would carefully pour those sizzling drippings into an old tin or glass jar tucked by the stove. Some folks might have thought it was just kitchen clutter, but it was pure gold. That grease became the backbone of countless meals. Beans simmered with smoky depth, fried vegetables that tasted richer than they had any right to, or gravy so flavorful you wanted to lick the spoon. It was not just about saving money, though that helped. It was about coaxing every last bit of taste from simple, humble ingredients. When you grow up watching Grandma stir bacon grease into supper, you realize the real secret to good cooking was never fancy gadgets or complicated recipes. It was knowing how to stretch flavor, quietly, without saying a word. Making biscuits taller with buttermilk and patience was an art form your grandma probably perfected behind closed doors, long before biscuit mix came in a box. You ever notice how her biscuits stood high and proud, golden on the outside, soft and fluffy with those flaky layers you could peel apart one by one? That was no accident, and it definitely was not beginner's luck. It all started with ice-cold buttermilk, the real deal, chilled straight from the icebox. She poured it gently, keeping the dough cool and loose so the biscuits stayed airy and never dense. But the real magic was patience. She handled that dough soft and slow, barely touching it, folding it with care, never overworking it, never rushing. Biscuits did not like to be fussed with, and Grandma knew every shortcut or heavy hand could ruin them. She never explained it, probably just smiled when those biscuits rose taller than your coffee mug, layers pulling apart like pages of a book. You would bite in, warm steam escaping, never realizing every perfect biscuit came from years of quiet practice, knowing the old ways, respecting the process, and keeping her kitchen secrets tucked away for those lucky enough to sit at the table. Reviving stale bread with a damp towel bake is one of those quiet, scrappy kitchen tricks your grandma probably pulled off dozens of times and you never even noticed. You ever wonder how that day-old loaf of bread, hard enough to hammer nails, magically turned soft and warm again, just in time for dinner? It was not magic. It was simple, quiet know-how, learned from years of stretching groceries and making every crumb count. Grandma would grab a clean dish towel, dampen it just enough, not soaking, just lightly misted, and wrapped that tired old bread like it was something special. Into the warm oven it went, and while you set the table or stirred the soup, the bread slowly softened, steam working its way through every dry crumb. Minutes later, you had a loaf that tasted fresh from the bakery, ready to soak up butter, jam, or stew. Grandmas never made a show of it, never called attention to how they saved old bread from the trash. They just worked those quiet little kitchen miracles, turning scraps into something worth sharing again, making sure nothing, not even the hardest loaf, ever went to waste. Secretly sweetening tomato sauce with a sugar pinch was one of those old-school kitchen tricks Grandma probably did more times than you could count, and you never saw it coming. You would sit down to a steaming plate of spaghetti, fork in hand, and wonder how that rich, mellow sauce tasted so perfect, so balanced, with none of that sharp, bitter edge tomatoes sometimes have. The secret was a pinch of sugar, small enough not to change the flavor, but powerful enough to smooth the whole thing out. Back then, tomatoes were not always the prettiest or ripest, and canned goods could be hit or miss. But Grandma knew how to fix that. A quick toss of sugar into the simmering sauce, and suddenly, dinner tasted like it came straight from a garden patch. It was not written down anywhere. It was one of those whispered kitchen habits passed down through generations, learned by watching, never by asking. Grandmas never made a fuss over small details like that, but those quiet, clever steps turned plain ingredients into something warm, hearty, and worth gathering around the table for, one simple sugar pinch at a time. Preventing fruit pies from boiling over with a knotted rag sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but your grandma probably did it more than once, and you never gave it a second thought. You would see that pie cooling on the counter, golden brown, bubbling fruit inside, and not a drop of sticky mess oozing down the sides, and wonder how she pulled it off every time. The trick? A simple cloth, damp or dry, tied neatly around the rim of the pie dish. It caught the bubbling juices as they tried to spill over, saving the oven from burnt sugar disasters and keeping the crust neat as a picture. Grandmas never learned these tricks from cooking shows or recipe books. They picked them up at church socials, neighborhood potlucks, or from their own mothers, watching with quiet curiosity. That little knotted rag was one of many unspoken habits tucked into every perfect pie crust and sweet, bubbling filling. The family never asked how the pie stayed so neat. They just ate, smiled, and thanked Grandma for making dessert look and taste like something straight out of a storybook every time. Using ice water for fluffier pancakes might sound backward today, but your grandma probably knew better than most people give her credit for. Pancake batter. Getting too warm? That was the quickest way to end up with flat, dense flapjacks instead of the fluffy golden stacks you remember. Grandma never let that happen. She reached for ice-cold water, or sometimes cold milk straight from the icebox, and gently stirred it into the batter, keeping everything cool and airy until it hit the hot griddle. You would sit there, fork ready, watching those pancakes puff up like little clouds, fluffy on the inside, golden brown on the edges, wondering why hers always tasted better than anyone else's. It was never luck. It was quiet kitchen skill, passed down in small, careful habits you barely noticed. Grandmas understood breakfast could make or break your whole day, and nothing lifted the mood like a plate stacked high with warm, soft pancakes. No one ever talked about the ice water trick, but they remembered the pancakes, the kind that turned an ordinary morning into something worth sitting down for, bite after bite. Disguising tough meat with slow-simmered onion gravy was one of those quiet survival tricks your grandma pulled off when money got tight. Back then, not every cut of meat was tender, and sometimes you had to stretch the tough stuff to feed a family. That is where the onion gravy came in. Slowly simmered, full of rich, sweet flavor, it turned cheap, chewy meat into something soft, savory, and satisfying. You would sit down thinking it was a fancy dinner, but really, it was Grandma's quiet genius working with what she had. She probably never said much about it, just stirred that pan, letting the onions caramelize, watching the gravy thicken, knowing dinner would turn out all right. Those meals stuck with you, not because they were fancy, but because they were clever, comforting, and filled with love disguised as good cooking. Turning leftover coffee into rich cake frosting was one of those sneaky little tricks that made Grandma's cakes impossible to forget even years later. Coffee might have been a luxury at times, but nothing in Grandma's kitchen went to waste, especially not that cold, leftover pot sitting forgotten on the stove. Instead of tossing it, Grandma poured it straight into the frosting, especially chocolate frosting, and just like that, the whole cake came to life. It added depth, richness, and that grown-up flavor you could never quite put your finger on. The coffee was subtle, you never tasted it outright, but it brought a warmth and boldness that made those cakes feel extra special. You would eat a slice, maybe two, thinking she used some expensive secret ingredient from a store shelf. But no, it was just that old pot of coffee and quiet, clever know-how passed down through years of making do. Grandma never announced her tricks, never needed applause, but every bite carried that hidden secret tucked neatly between the layers, wrapped up in frosting and family tradition. Cakes like that were more than dessert. They were quiet reminders of how far a little creativity could stretch. Keeping sugar soft with a slice of bread sounds odd now, but back then Grandma probably did it without blinking. Sugar was not always as cheap, and nothing spoiled baking plans faster than a rock-hard, clumpy pile of sugar in the canister. The fix? Quietly slipping a plain old slice of bread right into the jar. It looked like nothing special, but it worked like magic, pulling in just enough moisture to keep sugar soft, scoopable, and ready for whatever recipe came next. You would pop open the container, expecting clumps, but somehow the sugar stayed perfect, smooth, ready for coffee, cookies, or a birthday cake. You never saw the bread hiding beneath the surface, but you saw the results in every spoonful. Grandmas never explained those tiny tricks. They just made them routine, quietly stretching groceries, saving time, and making sure nothing, not even sugar, went to waste. That humble slice of bread might not have looked impressive sitting in the jar, but it kept baking, coffee, and sweet moments running smoothly in homes that knew how much every crumb counted. Frying potatoes in saved lard for extra crispness was a quiet, unwritten rule in Grandma's kitchen, and anyone lucky enough to eat there knew it worked. Sure, cooking oil did the job, but if you wanted golden, crisp edges and rich, savory flavor that made your mouth water, lard was the answer. Bacon drippings, pork fat, or whatever was left from previous meals got carefully poured into an old jar tucked by the stove. It was never tossed. It was saved like liquid gold. When it came time to fry, Grandma reached for that jar, never saying much, just knowing it would bring those potatoes to life. They came out crackly on the outside, soft and creamy inside, tasting better than anything from a diner down the road. It was not about showing off fancy recipes. It was about resourcefulness, stretching ingredients, and making every meal shine with what you had. Grandmas learned early that nothing in the kitchen should be wasted, and those potatoes, crisp and perfect, were quiet proof of everyday brilliance passed down through generations of smart, frugal cooking. Thickening soups with crushed saltines might seem simple now, but back then it was quiet genius, passed down like a family secret. You would sit down to a pot of soup, maybe thin, maybe watery, and somehow by the time dinner hit the table, it was thick, rich, and hearty. No fancy flours, no expensive thickeners, just a handful of plain saltine crackers crushed right in Grandma's hands, dissolving into the broth without a trace. They soaked up liquid, adding body and depth, turning simple stews and chowders into filling, satisfying meals. Grandmas never bragged about it. They just watched quietly, knowing that small tricks made the difference between a skimpy meal and one that left everyone full and content. It was never about having the fanciest ingredients. It was about working smart, making the most of what little you had, and turning everyday staples into something that brought everyone to the table with a smile. That handful of crackers? Just another quiet, clever fix from kitchens built on stretching groceries and never wasting a crumb. Saving overripe bananas for moist cakes was one of those quiet little traditions Grandma never needed to announce, but you could taste the results in every sweet, soft slice. You would walk into the kitchen, spot those brown spotted bananas sitting there, and probably assume they were destined for the trash. But not in Grandma's house. She saw those tired bananas as baking gold, packed with sweetness and ready to transform plain batter into something rich and moist. The riper the banana, the softer it blended into the cake, filling every crumb with natural sugar and keeping it tender for days. Banana bread, muffins, pound cakes, they all owed their irresistible texture to fruit most folks tossed without a second thought. Grandmas understood the kitchen was not just about following recipes. It was about stretching ingredients, wasting nothing, and turning overlooked scraps into something worth gathering around. You might not have known the secret behind that banana bread growing up, but your second helping told the story loud and clear. Crisping fried chicken with cornstarch and flour mix was one of those quiet little secrets Grandma tucked into every Sunday dinner. You would hear the sizzle, smell that golden crust frying, and bite into the crisp, airy coating, wondering how it always turned out perfect. The answer? A scoop of cornstarch, blended with the flour, hidden in plain sight. It was not fancy, but it worked, making the crust light, shatteringly crisp without weighing down the chicken or turning it greasy. Back then, store-bought mixes and fancy breading were not an option, but grandmas knew how to make meals special with simple pantry tricks. That little bit of cornstarch turned ordinary chicken into something that rivaled any restaurant, all while keeping budgets low and bellies full. You never saw her do it. You just tasted the difference, one crunchy, satisfying bite at a time. Hiding leftover meat in rice-stuffed peppers was one of those quiet, practical kitchen moves Grandma perfected without ever drawing attention to it. You would glance at those colorful peppers stuffed high with rice, herbs, and sauce, and think dinner was something fresh and fancy, but really, it was thrift and know-how in every bite. Grandma slipped yesterday's roast, bits of sausage, even scraps of ground meat right into the filling, stretching what little was left into a meal that felt generous and filling. The rice bulked it up, the sauce brought it together, and suddenly leftovers disappeared into something new, hearty, and satisfying. Grandmas never wasted a crumb, but they also never made a show of it. Dinner showed up, steaming hot, tasting like a full-course feast, and no one suspected the leftovers hiding inside. That quiet trick kept plates full, stretched budgets, and turned barely enough into plenty to go around. Keeping pie fillings from sogging crust with breadcrumbs was one of those old kitchen tricks Grandma never mentioned out loud, but you saw the results every time dessert hit the table. You would slice into a peach, apple, or berry pie and wonder how the bottom crust stayed crisp and flaky, never soggy or gummy like store-bought versions. The answer was not luck. It was breadcrumbs. Grandma sprinkled a light layer of them under the fruit filling, where they quietly soaked up excess juices, protecting the crust without changing the flavor. No one tasted breadcrumbs, but everyone noticed how perfect that pie held together. Grandmas learned long ago that good cooking came down to small, clever steps no one ever bragged about. Those breadcrumbs saved pies, saved messes, and turned humble desserts into bakery-worthy creations with nothing more than quiet, everyday know-how passed down through generations. Quietly boosting stews with Worcestershire sauce was one of those old kitchen secrets Grandma kept to herself, but it made all the difference. You would walk into the house, smell that stew simmering low on the stove, rich and savory, and swear there was some special seasoning hidden in there. Truth was, there was, but it came from a little glass bottle tucked in the pantry, often overlooked but never forgotten. A few drops of Worcestershire sauce were all it took to deepen the broth, adding layers of flavor that made plain stews feel like they had been simmering in a restaurant kitchen all day. It brought a hint of tang, a touch of umami, and just enough richness to stretch simple ingredients into something that felt hearty, filling, and complete. Grandmas understood meals had to be more than just food. They had to be satisfying, comforting, and worth sitting down for, even when the meat was scarce or the vegetables were humble. You might not have seen her use it, but you sure tasted it in every spoonful. That quiet little bottle carried decades of kitchen wisdom, quietly elevating simple meals without anyone the wiser. Cooling cookies fast with a brown paper bag layer was one of those practical, clever tricks Grandma always had up her sleeve, though she probably never called it a trick at all. Fancy wire racks were nice if you had them, but not every kitchen did, especially in homes where money was tight and gadgets were rare. But a brown paper bag from the grocery store? That worked better than most would expect. Grandma would cut it open, lay it flat on the counter, and place warm cookies right on top. The paper absorbed just enough moisture to cool the cookies quickly, while the bottoms crisped up perfectly. No sticking, no soggy spots, no mess to wash after. It was simple, effective, and completely quiet. The kind of trick that came from making do with what you had, turning leftovers and scraps into small victories. You would sneak one off the bag, still warm, still crisp, and never think twice about the paper beneath. But Grandma's old-school know-how was right there, hidden under every perfect homemade cookie. Turning potato water into soup base was one of those humble, brilliant moves Grandma pulled off without ever calling attention to it. After boiling potatoes for dinner, most folks drained that cloudy, starchy water straight into the sink, but Grandma never wasted a thing, especially not something so useful. That leftover water, rich with starch and nutrients, became the foundation for hearty soups, creamy gravies, and even stews that tasted like they simmered for hours. It added body, a little thickness, and a subtle, earthy flavor that brought everything together without needing expensive stock or extra ingredients. Grandma's new meals had to stretch, groceries had to last, and waste was never an option. You would sip that soup, warm, rich, and filling, and never guess it started with something most people tossed away. It was resourceful, practical cooking. Quiet genius passed down through generations, born from hard times but still making meals better today. Making milk last longer with powdered milk stretch was one of those behind-the-scenes tricks Grandma kept tucked away for when times got tough. You would pour a glass of milk onto your cereal or stir it into coffee, and it looked, poured, and tasted just like the real deal. What you never knew was half that pitcher came straight from a box of powdered milk quietly hidden in the back of the pantry. Groceries did not always stretch far enough, and with kids to feed, coffee to make, and recipes to bake, there was no room for running out of the basics. Powdered milk mixed with fresh milk doubled the supply and kept breakfast and baking on track when money was tight. Grandmas never made a fuss about it. They just got things done, quietly stretching ingredients, making sure no one went without. The funny thing is, you never tasted the difference. That milk poured smooth, worked just right, and held the family over till the next grocery run. It was not a big secret. It was just quiet. Practical kitchen know-how passed down through generations, one stretch at a time. Sneaking vinegar into poached egg water for perfect shape was one of those old kitchen tricks Grandma never announced, but you sure noticed the results. You would sit down to breakfast, slice into that perfectly poached egg, the yolk warm and runny, the white holding its neat, delicate shape, and never suspect how it happened. Turns out, a splash of vinegar in the water made all the difference. Without it, the egg whites would scatter like silk threads across the pot, turning breakfast into a mess. But Grandma knew better. A tiny pour of vinegar firmed the whites fast, keeping the egg together, tidy and ready to impress. It was never about being fancy. It was quiet confidence built from experience, knowing small details turned a meal from ordinary to special. You never saw the vinegar bottle come out, but that egg on your plate, soft and flawless, told the story loud and clear. Keeping biscuits fresh with a damp dish towel wrap was one of those quiet tricks Grandma used to make sure nothing ever went to waste. You would reach for a biscuit hours after they came out of the oven, and it was still warm, fluffy, and soft enough to melt butter like it had just finished baking. But Grandma never rushed to the store for airtight containers or special wraps. She just dampened a clean dish towel, wrapped those biscuits up, and tucked them away. The gentle steam kept them soft, holding in moisture like a little edible blanket. You might not have seen the towel come out, but you sure tasted the difference. It was one of those small acts of care grandmas carried in their kitchens. Quiet, practical, passed down from women who learned how to stretch food, save leftovers, and make sure a meal stayed good long after the oven cooled. Biscuits were more than bread on the table. They were a little reminder that small tricks done quietly could make food stretch and keep everyone smiling. Fooling guests with mock apple pie using crackers sounds wild today, but for grandmas back in the Depression era, it was quiet, sweet genius. Apples were scarce, but dessert was not something you skipped, especially not when company was coming. So grandma got clever. She crushed saltine crackers, softened them with sugar, cinnamon, and just the right touch of spice, layering them into a golden pie crust so good you would swear it was made from fresh apples. You would slice in, taste the warm filling, smell the butter and cinnamon, and never suspect the trick hiding in plain sight. Grandmas never bragged. They just served it up, smiled at the compliments, and quietly stretched ingredients when fruit was hard to find. That pie was more than dessert. It was proof that with a little kitchen know-how and a lot of heart, you could turn hard times into sweet memories, one slice at a time. Coating fruit in gelatin for a longer-lasting salad was one of those old-fashioned tricks Grandma never bragged about, but every family picnic or church gathering proved it worked like a charm. You would walk past the food tables and see her fruit salad still looking bright, shiny, and perfect, even after hours in the sun. Grapes still plump, oranges still juicy, strawberries still holding their color, not a mushy mess in sight. The secret? A light coating of flavored gelatin stirred over the fruit, sealing in the moisture and keeping everything looking fresh. It was not about making the salad jiggly or strange. It was quiet protection that kept the fruit safe from heat and time. Grandmas understood presentation mattered, especially when food sat out at big gatherings, and they knew how to keep things looking their best with simple, practical tricks that never needed explaining. You just showed up, grabbed a scoop of that fruit salad, and wondered how hers always stayed picture perfect while everyone else's wilted. It was not magic. It was quiet know-how passed down through kitchens, picnics, and potlucks, one gelatin-coated grape at a time. Keeping cake moist with applesauce substitute was one of those resourceful little baking tricks Grandma pulled off without saying a word. You would take a bite of that cake, rich, soft, and perfectly sweet, and never know she swapped in applesauce to stretch the ingredients. When eggs or butter ran low, and they often did, Grandma did not panic or skip dessert. She reached for a jar of applesauce and made that batter work just as well, maybe even better. Applesauce added moisture, subtle sweetness, and kept cakes from drying out, all without fancy ingredients or expensive trips to the store. It was quiet, practical kitchen smarts passed down through years of making do and stretching groceries. No one at the table knew, and Grandma never mentioned it. She just smiled when the plates came back clean. The best part? That cake still felt like a treat, even when supplies were tight, proving again that small tricks and a little heart turned simple meals into something special. Tricking kids with hidden veggies and meatloaf was the kind of sneaky, brilliant move Grandma pulled off all the time, and no one ever caught on. Meat was expensive, vegetables were necessary, but getting kids to eat them? That was a battle in itself. So Grandma got clever. She finely grated carrots, zucchini, onions, sometimes even spinach. So small they blended right into the meatloaf mix. Along with breadcrumbs, herbs, and seasonings, those veggies disappeared into the loaf, stretching the protein and sneaking in nutrients at the same time. The kids never knew, and honestly, neither did most of the adults. They just ate slice after slice, never suspecting their dinner was doing double duty. Grandmas understood meals had to fill bellies, stretch ingredients, and keep everyone healthy, all without turning dinner into a fight. It was quiet kitchen know-how, tucked into every bite, passed down through generations, keeping meals hearty and homes happy. Making pancake syrup from brown sugar and water was one of those quiet, clever fixes Grandma always had ready when the pantry shelves got low. You would sit down to a stack of hot pancakes, butter melting, fork in hand, and never suspect the syrup came from the stove, not the store shelf. Brown sugar, simmered with water, turned into a rich, sticky syrup with deep molasses sweetness that made breakfast feel special. Store-bought syrup was expensive and sometimes impossible to get, but Grandma never let that stop breakfast from being complete. She mixed, simmered, and poured, turning pantry basics into something better than anything off the grocery shelf. Grandmas did not need fancy bottles or big brand names. They made their kitchens work with quiet resourcefulness and old-school know-how. That syrup? Sweet proof you could always stretch a little into a lot, as long as you knew the right tricks. Saving butter wrappers to grease pans was one of those smart little habits Grandma never had to explain. You just saw the results. After unwrapping a stick of butter, she never tossed that waxy paper in the trash. Instead, she folded it neatly, tucked it away in the fridge or a drawer, waiting for the next time a pan needed greasing. When it was time to bake a cake or fry in a skillet, that wrapper came out, still holding just enough buttery goodness to coat a pan perfectly. It was no mess, no waste, just quiet efficiency. Grandmas understood nothing should be thrown away. Not scraps, not crumbs, not butter wrappers. Every little thing in the kitchen had value, and small tricks like this made meals smoother, baking easier, and clean up faster. You might not have noticed the wrapper come out, but you sure tasted the difference every time that cake slid right out of the pan without a fuss. Keeping brown sugar soft with a marshmallow might sound like an old wives' tale, but your grandma probably swore by it, and for good reason. Brown sugar has a bad habit of turning rock hard when it sits too long, clumping into a mess that made baking a chore. But Grandma had a fix tucked away, quiet and clever. She dropped a single marshmallow into the jar, where it kept the sugar soft and scoopable for weeks. It was not flashy, but it worked better than any fancy gadget or store-bought trick. Grandmas understood how to stretch ingredients, protect their pantry, and make sure nothing went to waste. Even something as simple as keeping sugar ready for cookies, cakes, and coffee. That marshmallow was not a snack. It was a quiet little guardian, working behind the scenes to make sure the kitchen ran smooth and dessert never had to wait. Grating cold butter with a cheese grater for pastry dough is one of those brilliant cookbook hacks that feels obvious once you know it. But nobody ever teaches you unless they hand down the trick. Flaky pie crust or biscuits depend on keeping your butter cold, but cutting it into flour evenly can be a nightmare, especially if your kitchen is warm. Old cookbooks solve that problem with one simple step: grate your butter like cheese. You would chill the stick, run it across the box grater, and suddenly, perfectly tiny shreds of butter fall into your flour mix. It blends faster, stays cold, and gives you that tender, flaky texture every time. Bakers back then leaned on this tip, whether they were making pies for Sunday dinner or biscuits to stretch the meal. Looking back, I cannot believe how many dense crusts or tough biscuits I struggled through before learning this. If someone had passed down this one old cookbook trick sooner, I would have been baking like a pro years ago. Now, speaking of retro, tuna jelly salad was a really vintage recipe that started coming into the spotlight around the 60s. This was the time when Jell-O and gelatin mold-based dishes were getting really popular. The idea was to use the gelatin mold to encase the tuna with a typical salad dressing, and it really worked back then. I'm not exactly sure how people would react to it now, since I think the idea of a tuna and gelatin crossover is a bit too bold for a lot of people's palates. I could always be wrong though, so you tell me, dear viewer. Would you take a tuna jelly salad to work? Or would you just make a quick run for the nearest Wendy's? I wouldn't blame you at all if you picked the second one. The idea behind salads like these was to throw a spin on an otherwise really boring format of cooking. Salads were okay, but they were never something Americans preferred with their whole hearts. Nowadays, that opinion really started to become public sentiment. Plus, as I was previously talking about, most people would opt for Starbucks now. And I'll tell you this right now, tuna, Jell-O, and caffeine do not go together. One more thing that you would be a fool if you didn't include in your pantry was homemade bread rolls. See, the thing about those survival tricks that people picked up during the Depression was that old habits die pretty hard, especially when they save as much money as these were. Lots of people, even ones who had never even caught a whiff of an oven, began to at least learn how to make their own bread at home during the Depression thanks to how cost-effective it was. I mean, really, how could you compete with it? All you needed back then were leavening and shortening agents, some flour and yeast, and while that was still hard to get, it made people that much more skilled at making do with what they had. This meant that when things did settle down and people got access to actual good ingredients they could use for making homemade bread rolls, they were fantastic at it. Store-bought bread rolls like Parker House just couldn't compete. Plus, it added this touch of care and personalization when you would bake a bread roll for someone for Thanksgiving, you know? The Klondike Choco Taco is a one-of-a-kind ice cream treat shaped like a taco. This inventive dessert features a waffle cone shell filled with vanilla ice cream and fudge. Introduced in 1984 by the Jack and Jill Ice Cream Company, the Choco Taco gained popularity for its innovative design and delicious taste. The dessert was inspired by traditional Mexican tacos, blending the concept with the classic ice cream cone. The waffle shell provides a crispy contrast to the creamy ice cream, while the chocolate coating adds a layer of sweetness. The Choco Taco was made by folding a waffle into a taco shape, filling it with ice cream and fudge, then dipping it in chocolate and sprinkling it with peanuts. The Choco Taco was a favorite at ice cream trucks and convenience stores, enjoyed by kids and adults alike. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. Crushing saltines as a budget breadcrumb substitute was one of those Depression-era tricks that quietly stuck around, tucked into old cookbooks and recipe cards. Breadcrumbs add crunch to fried food or bind meatballs, but they were not always easy to come by when pantries ran low. Saltine crackers? Almost every household had a box. You would crush them up fine and use them just like breadcrumbs. They added a crispy coating to fried chicken, stretched ground beef and meatloaf, or even worked as a topping for casseroles. It was practical, frugal, and made dinner stretch farther without sacrificing flavor or texture. Families leaned on this hack during tight times, and honestly, it holds up today. I spent way too many years shelling out for fancy breadcrumbs when a box of crackers and a rolling pin would have done the trick. Sometimes old cookbook tricks really do make the most sense. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were a really straightforward dish. There wasn't a lot going on here, and it was really just a 3-ingredient dish. Finally, we're going to back sandwiches we can actually recognize and digest. Who has their stuff cold? Not me. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches luckily aren't exactly things you serve cold either. This is a dish best served piping hot. See, liverwurst in itself is just a sausage that's been made with liver and some other parts of meat. Then you take in some raw onions and sauté them, serve them between slices of toasted bread with cheese, and there you go. Liverwurst is something we got from European and German communities, and it was really popular in areas like Detroit and Pennsylvania, where there were strong populations of European communities. Liverwurst was typically always blended with warm spices like allspice and nutmeg too, so you could either make it into this flavorful pâté or slice it and layer it with other kinds of things as well as cheese, of course. It's something that just faded out of relevance, though. It wasn't bad or impractical, but I guess it was a little too simple. Potato salad with mayonnaise was a potluck and picnic classic, and many gatherings like that in the 50s relied on this for being the backbone of the whole thing. Plus, there was some serious divide between what mayonnaise to even use. You might think it's a ridiculous thing to be picky about, but being picky is an understatement. These people were loyal, man. It was like a cult. Home cooks were split between Hellmann's or Miracle Whip, which was Kraft's new Golden Boy that they had spared no expense for marketing. Besides the mayonnaise madness, people got along pretty well on what else to throw in the salad. Some pickle relishes and dill pickles were really economical, and they had a way of spicing up the salad like nothing else. Hard-boiled eggs were something the guys loved a lot, and yellow mustard just had to be there. One of the best parts of a mayonnaise salad was the way you could just serve it chilled. So that meant that after you were done preparing it, you could throw it in the refrigerator and forget about it until you got the message about the potluck at 5 p.m. Saturday. Fat Frog ice cream bars are whimsical green frog-shaped ice cream bars, typically lime-flavored with gumball eyes. These playful treats were introduced by HB Ice Cream in the 1980s and were popular for their fun appearance and refreshing taste. They were marketed as part of a range of animal-themed ice creams by HB, with other options including fish and dinosaurs. The bars are made from creamy, lime-flavored ice cream and have two gumballs as eyes, which add a fun element for kids to enjoy. Fat Frog ice cream bars were often found in ice cream trucks and at convenience stores. These bars were enjoyed as a refreshing treat on summer days or as a playful snack at parties, providing a burst of citrus flavor and a smile for those who enjoyed them. Bologna and cheese stackers were pretty much the ideal American breakfast, something that carried the spirit of our nation as well as all the flavors we've grown to love. Sliced bologna would be layered with cheese from the finest wheels in all of the United States of America. It would be packed in wax paper too, which was a funny little trick, but I'll explain why it was so popular. See, the thing about wax paper is that it traps moisture and flavor in, and that means your stackers stay perfectly fine just the way they were after you first made them. Bologna was always something we've had a deep appreciation for, and this stacker variant just proved that no matter how much the landscape of American cuisine changes, some habits die hard, and some just don't die at all. Not only was it just a good thing to eat before or after work, it was the perfect lunch to carry in a box with you. Plus, by the end of the 20th century, most offices had microwaves too, and you could always just find slices of bologna for cheap at most convenience stores. It was this kind of low-effort, easy-to-source and assemble style of cooking that would overtake America soon enough, and I think that's a part of why a lot of us prefer a latte instead of a sandwich now, ironically enough. Quick pickling vegetables with vinegar and sugar was pure genius for stretching meals and adding flavor when groceries ran thin. Home cooks back then knew how to make ingredients pull double duty, and pickling was their go-to trick for brightening up plates without fancy seasonings or expensive sides. You would slice up cucumbers, onions, or whatever veggies were on hand, toss them in a mix of vinegar, sugar, salt, and water, and let them sit for a few hours or even minutes. Suddenly, you had tangy, crisp pickles to serve alongside sandwiches, pot roasts, or beans. It added crunch, cut through heavy meals, and made leftovers feel new again. Quick pickles showed up in nearly every old cookbook for a reason. They were fast, cheap, and full of flavor when budgets were tight. It is the kind of trick I wish had landed in my kitchen sooner. How many dull, plain dinners could have been saved with just vinegar, sugar, and a little old-school know-how? Jell-O pudding pops are frozen pops made from Jell-O pudding, offering a creamy and smooth texture. These treats come in various flavors, including chocolate, vanilla, and swirl, and were a favorite among kids for their rich taste. Introduced by Jell-O in the 1970s, these pops became a popular frozen dessert option, combining the beloved flavors of Jell-O pudding with the refreshing qualities of a frozen treat. The pops are made by blending Jell-O pudding mix with milk and freezing the mixture into popsicle molds. The result is a creamy, icy pop that melts in your mouth, delivering a burst of flavor with every bite. The idea for these pops stemmed from the popularity of pudding as a comfort food, and Jell-O capitalized on this by creating a frozen version that was easy to enjoy on the go. These treats were also popular at birthday parties, where kids loved the creamy texture and delicious flavors. So, chicken cordon bleu is another funny one. It's something that is strictly middle class, but you can just tell this dish is trying to be something more. The fascination that the American population had with French and European cuisine and culture in the middle of the 60s was definitely interesting. It was a fascination that went into our cookbooks, our magazines, our media and movies, our dinners and our parties, and our restaurants. So you have to think, how did it really get this far? Well, again, it's kind of what I said before. Americans got tired of the typical, the regular, the mundane. They didn't want the same Monday to Friday menu they were used to, both at their regular joints and at home. They wanted fresh new flavors. Why do you think out of all the things that got popular and ended up being nation-swooping trends, fusion food and hybrid experimentations were the ones that took the cake? It's because more than anything, After a first half of the century that put them through the ringer and a diet that hadn't changed in over a century, people just wanted something new. Chicken cordon bleu was a fresh and interesting new way of having chicken breasts. It was cheap, affordable, and it came in frozen packets, which made it all the more convenient. And don't let anyone ever tell you we didn't get inspired by the French either. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Lettuce cups and shrimp salads were pretty funny. I mean, not exactly funny, but interesting. The assembly was something you would need skill for, though, which isn't at all similar to things like peanut butter and bacon sandwiches or corned beef and cabbage wraps. Leaves had to be carefully plucked from the head of the lettuce, and these would end up forming the shape of the cups. You would then spoon the cups with fillings, which were typically things like spices, vegetables, and stir-fried ground meat, but this instance of the dish has shrimp salad instead. Why was something like this popular? Well, besides a lot of influence from Asian culture, such as Thai and Chinese wraps, they were just easy. I mean, sure, you had to get used to making a lettuce cup, but that wasn't really the hardest thing to do. What was absolutely outstanding about these was the presentation. The sheer visual appeal that this dish had wasn't something you could ever compete with, honestly. I mean, a flowery-looking cup made out of lettuce leaves? That's artistic. Plus, the vibrant and colorful fillings inside would just make it pop off even more. As far as food goes, this one was definitely a slay. Once you did get one made, then you would simply have to prepare it by heating it up. They weren't really as good for lunch at work as they were for finger foods and a pretty-looking side or appetizer at a party, though. Pickled beet and goat cheese sandwiches were like pretty much the same thing as a lot of the recipes from the Depression era that you see persisting beyond the 50s. There's something that people back then acquired a taste for, but this combo really brought out the best of them too. Chèvre, or as we know it, goat cheese, was something that was actually not too popular in America, though. It was something that French, Spanish, and Italian immigrants popularized, but it was something that was originally first introduced in America by European settlers. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a niche thing. Not exactly the main character or a big part of the B-plot, but it was a good extra in the background, sometimes the foreground, know what I mean? Lots of small-scale farming and goat dairy farms did start to open up in places like Wisconsin, Oregon, California, and Vermont, and when the health scares started, the government only started pushing things like goat's cheese more. It wasn't a big stretch to move towards sandwiches then, and the beet and goat cheese combo was already something that worked. In today's day and age, this sandwich just isn't flashy, substantial, or tasty enough to last, though. But some people still keep it as a vegan-friendly option. Banquet fried chicken consists of frozen fried chicken pieces that offer a convenient and tasty meal option. Introduced in 1953 by Banquet Foods, banquet fried chicken quickly became a staple in American households, especially appreciated for its ability to provide a classic comfort food with minimal effort. The chicken is typically made from breaded and seasoned chicken parts, such as drumsticks, thighs, and breasts, which are then fried to a golden brown. Banquet fried chicken was often served with sides like mashed potatoes, green beans, or corn, creating a complete meal that was easy to prepare and enjoy. The convenience of frozen fried chicken made it an ideal choice for busy nights or casual gatherings, providing an easy meal that didn't skimp on flavor. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. failing economy on one side, and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches are a bit of a hit or miss, depending on the kind of stuff you prefer. But throughout Thanksgiving, you'd basically see people bringing nothing else but this. Why? Well, I know that you all know cranberries and cranberry jams, sauces, and desserts get really popular around Thanksgiving, but have you ever wondered why? Spoiler alert, it's not just tradition. See, across the Appalachians to California, throughout Wisconsin and Northern America, cranberries have been one of the few things that were always indigenous to our country. That's why we abuse them to the moon and back, you know? Then you throw in canned cranberries and convenience stores popping up in every neighborhood, and well, you start to see how people end up with so many leftovers. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches would be made so often to dispose of leftover cranberries that it wouldn't be uncommon to see pretty much everyone at work pulling up with one of these, though that did mean they got old really fast. Probably why nobody brings them anymore, to be honest. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches are a bit of a hit or miss, depending on the kind of stuff you prefer. But throughout Thanksgiving, you'd basically see people bringing nothing else but this. Why? Well, I know that you all know cranberries and cranberry jams, sauces, and desserts get really popular around Thanksgiving, but have you ever wondered why? Spoiler alert, it's not just tradition. See, across the Appalachians to California, throughout Wisconsin and Northern America, cranberries have been one of the few things that were always indigenous to our country. That's why we abuse them to the moon and back, you know? Then you throw in canned cranberries and convenience stores popping up in every neighborhood, and well, you start to see how people end up with so many leftovers. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches would be made so often to dispose of leftover cranberries that it wouldn't be uncommon to see pretty much everyone at work pulling up with one of these, though that did mean they got old really fast. Probably why nobody brings them anymore, to be honest. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Fish finger sandwiches started off as being wonderful party food and a pretty reasonable meal to go for at diners, but they ended up being something that was also a dish people wanted more of in their daily routines. Some tartar sauce, a fried fish, and 2 slices of bread have never done anyone wrong. It's something you can rely on, and it's a perfect intersection between convenient, unfamiliar, and healthy. Lots of people that were trying to take care of their diet, cut out a bit of their usual sources of protein, and just eat a bit more organic would opt for sandwiches like this. I think if you ever really want to make something pop off in America, you just put it in a sandwich, because that at least guarantees that everyone will try it, you know? Fish finger sandwiches are sometimes a recipe that people say we got from European culture, but it's something I think fishermen have been living off of forever. So not only is this a dish you would see in a tech labyrinth, otherwise known as offices, you would also just see fishermen and dock workers eating these after a hard day's work. It would put some pep in your step, and that's never really something people can have too much of. I think that now sandwiches have become more advanced since accessibility has only gone up with the amount of frozen foods we have now, so these probably have taken a bit of a back seat. Morton pot pies are frozen pot pies with flaky crusts and savory fillings, such as chicken or beef with vegetables. These classic comfort foods were introduced by Morton Frozen Foods in the 1940s, offering a hearty meal in a single dish. The pies feature a golden, buttery crust that encases a rich and flavorful filling. Morton pot pies were particularly popular for their convenience and taste, providing a meal that could be enjoyed at home or on the go. The pies were traditionally baked in the oven, allowing the crust to become crispy and golden, while the filling remained hot and savory. Morton pot pies were often enjoyed as a comforting dinner or a quick lunch, offering a delicious and filling option for any time of day. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. Parmesan chicken who? The only friend I have here is veal parmesan, or as it's otherwise known in its homeland, veal parmigiana. This is something that just doesn't sound like it's in the appropriate tax bracket for this video, but bear with me. There is more than one way to enjoy a night out and feel like you're balling on top of it. Italian-American restaurants in the 50s had begun to really take off. They had become this national thing, you know? And one of the biggest hit sellers on their menu was veal parmesan, and it was common for families that dined out to not only try it, but to also recreate it. You had people using canned tomato sauce, though, like Hunt's or Del Monte and Kraft Parmesan, so that's how you knew you were still eating a little on the cheaper side. Actual veal parmesan in Italy has to use fresh tomato sauce and Parmigiano Reggiano. But hey, you gotta save money for that burrito wrap on the way to work, the cab fare both ways back, and the bills, you know? Storing brown sugar with a slice of bread is such a small, brilliant kitchen hack that it feels criminal I did not know it sooner. Brown sugar loves to clump and harden, turning into one rock-solid brick that ruins your baking plans. But old cookbooks had the answer all along. You just tuck a slice of bread into the sugar container and close the lid. The bread's moisture softens the sugar, keeping it fluffy and ready to use for weeks. It worked wonders for cookie dough, muffins, or anything that called for that sweet molasses flavor. Folks in the 60s and 70s relied on this trick, especially when ingredients had to stretch longer between grocery trips. Honestly, I have chipped away at enough hardened sugar to wish someone shared this sooner. One slice of bread, one old cookbook tip, and no more ruined recipes. Friendly's Watermelon Roll is a unique ice cream dessert shaped like a watermelon slice, with a watermelon-flavored center, lemon-flavored rind, and chocolate chips as seeds. This refreshing treat was introduced by Friendly's in the 1980s and quickly became a favorite summer dessert. It was part of Friendly's seasonal summer menu, which featured other unique frozen treats as well. The ice cream is crafted to resemble a watermelon, with vibrant colors and realistic detailing that make it visually appealing. Friendly's Watermelon Roll is made from a combination of watermelon and lemon sherbet, creating a light and fruity flavor. The addition of chocolate chips as seeds adds a touch of sweetness and fun to the dessert, enhancing its playful appearance. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty. Or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. So, like I was just telling you, Spam used to be the next big thing, and for good reason too. We had things like Spam and cheese roll-ups. A typical 70s office lunch would look like slices of Spam that had been rolled up with mustard and cheese. Now, these could either be grilled to enhance the smokiness of the Spam and make it contrast nicer with the pineapple, or you could bake it so that the cheese would melt and the mustard would mix in with it better for an overall more well-rounded flavor. All things considered, this was on the right track. It was quick, it was tasty, it was healthy, and it was also what people needed during a time where re-entering the workforce was really hard and put a lot of people out of their usual routines. The thing is, America is known for fickle trends. We'll like something one day, swear by it the next, and forget it halfway into the night. Spam and cheese roll-ups were good, but they took a sideline and started being party food more than a work lunch. Share your grandma's secret trick in the comments and hit like and subscribe so we can keep these old kitchen secrets alive.